2019. Alcinda Honwana is Interregional Advisor on Social Development Policy at the United Nations, although she asked me to tell you that she is here in her personal capacity and not as a representative of the United Nations. She is also Visiting Professor of Anthropology and International Development at the Open University, where she held the chair in International Development and directed the International Development Center from 2005 to 2010. Honwana was also a program director at the Social Science Research Council in New York and taught anthropology at the New School of Social Research in New York and at the University of Cape Town. Alcinda Honwana has carried out extensive research on political conflict and politics of culture, on the impact of war on children and youth, as well as on youth politics, social movements, and political protest. Her latest books include her 2013 book, Youth and Revolution in Tunisia, and her 2012 book, The Time of Youth, Work, Social Change, and Politics in Africa. She's speaking to us today on the titled topic of Youth Struggles from the Arab Spring to Black Lives Matter and Beyond. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the African Studies Association, in particular the African Studies Review, for inviting me to deliver this lecture. I thank Professor Sean Redding for the generous introduction. And given that the topic of this lecture, I'd like to dedicate it to two young women that are in this room, my daughters, Nyeleti and Nandi. Come, mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new if you can't lend a hand, because for the times they are changing. In 1963, these lyrics by Bob Dylan, For the Times They Are Changing, foreshadowed the youth uprisings of 1968 in Europe. However, Dylan's generation appears to have lost its fight and to have been co-opted into the establishment. Half a century later, Europe and most of the world is witnessing a new wave of youth protests that stem from socioeconomic, political, and cultural grievances. This new wave of protests started in the African continent, when in 2011, young Tunisians and Egyptians took to the streets and ousted long-standing dictatorships. These events marked the beginning of a new era in youth political activism across the world. Street protests, riots, and demonstrations were carried out by youth in places across the world, such as Senegal, Greece, South Africa, Chile, Hong Kong, Portugal, Burkina Faso, the UK, Brazil, and the US. Beyond the wide disparities in their material, cultural, and political situations, young people in rich and poor countries are affected by similar problems of exclusion and restricted futures. These worldwide uprisings need to be understood in the context of this generation's struggle for political, social, and economic emancipation. In this lecture, I'll develop three fundamental arguments. First, youth protest movements stem directly from the economic and social pressures that young people endure and from their pervasive political marginalization. Young people in Africa are living in what I call waithood, a prolonged, difficult, and dynamic transition into adulthood. But waithood, it's not just an African experience. Young people in the developed North also grapple with the same issues of joblessness and political exclusion. I discuss waithood and the ways in which it is manifested in Africa and in the developed countries. Second, I argue that young people are rebelling against the status quo. They have been moving away from dispersed and unstructured social and political acts and into more organized protests in the public arena. Central here is the loss of faith in the ability of politicians to deliver concrete responses to young people's needs and expectations. The realities of young women and young men's daily lives expose the gap between the promise of equity, individual freedoms, and prosperity, and their experience of marginalization, exclusion, and lack of opportunities. Moreover, they are increasingly aware of the complicity between global and local forces that lead to corrupt governments acting with impunity across the world. And my third argument is that political protest movements continue to impact social and political change, such as the fall of autocratic regimes and the reversal of unpopular government policy. More significantly, these movements have prompted fundamental changes in young people's mindset, allowing them to believe that their actions matter and can make a difference. Nevertheless, they have not been able to effect systemic change. While profound transformation takes time, the questions young people are wrestling with include how to move beyond street protests and play an active role in politics and government. And also, how can this generation create a new kind of politics? My analysis is based on in-depth interviews I conducted with young people in various African countries, which resulted in my two latest books, The Time of Youth and Youth and Revolution in Tunisia. It is also informed by my reading of youth struggles and youth social movements across the globe. In Africa, young people constitute a disenfranchised majority living in waithood, a liminal space in which they are neither dependent children nor autonomous adults. They are largely excluded from major socioeconomic institutions and political processes. Whatever their class background, many youths have no secure jobs and cannot afford to establish families and start their own households. The ability to work and provide for themselves and for others defines a person's self-worth and position in the family and in the community, and constitutes an important marker of adulthood. The experience of waithood among young people differs by class, gender, and level of education. Men face the pressures of getting a steady job, finding a home, and covering the costs of marriage and family building. Although women are becoming better educated and have always engaged in productive labor alongside household chores, marriage and motherhood are still important markers of adulthood. While giving birth may provide girls with an entry into adulthood, their ability to attain full adult status often depends on men moving beyond waithood. Middle-class youth with stronger socioeconomic and political connections may experience waithood differently. In Mozambique in the past, becoming a labor migrant in the South African mines constituted a rite of passage to adulthood. As exploitative as the South African mining sector might have been, these jobs help young Mozambicans to become husbands, fathers, and providers to their families, and in turn, allowed young women to become wives, mothers, and homemakers. Similarly, getting a university degree guaranteed access to jobs and upward mobility for new graduates. Today, however, African societies do not offer reliable pathways to adulthood. Traditional ways of making this transition have broken down, and new ways of attaining adult status are yet to be developed. However, the young are not merely waiting and hoping that their situation will change of its own accord. Waithood is propelling them to be more creative and improvise livelihoods outside of dominant economic and familial frameworks. Young people in waithood are creating new dynamic sites for inventiveness and survival. From interviews with young people, in my book, The Time of Youth, I describe the extemporaneous and precarious nature of their lives. Young Mozambicans use the expression, the Portuguese expression, desenrascar a vida, to eke out a living. Young Senegalese and Tunisians use the French word débrouillage, making do. And young South Africans said, we are just getting by. The idea of desenrascar a vida, or débrouillage, situates the waithood experience in the realm of improvisation, of making it up as you go along, and entails a conscious effort to assess challenges and possibilities, as well as plot scenarios conducive to achievement of specific goals. These young people operate like Lévi-Strauss's bricoleur, a jack of all trades who manipulates and takes advantages of circumstances whenever possible to attain his or her own goals. These young people's actions also function like Michel Dissertaux's tactics, or daily struggles that respond to immediate needs rather than long-term strategies designed to achieve broader ends. Young Africans discover and invent new ways of existing in the margins. This is the experience of many young men and women who engage in street vending, cross-border trading and smuggling, those who migrate illegally to South Africa or to Europe, and those who end up in criminal networks as swindlers, traffickers, and gangsters. Young women and young men often see little option, but also to use their sexuality as means of gaining a livelihood. They engage in intimate and sometimes exploitative relationships with wealthy and powerful men and women, commonly known as sugar daddies and sugar mamas, for money, gifts, and access to fashionable goods. Some young people become successful entrepreneurs. Depending on their gender, they have taken up activities such as repairing electronic devices, making and marketing clothing and jewelry, and doing hair and nails. Others are creating new artistic forms, musical and performance forms, making graffiti, painting murals, writing blogs, and becoming savvy internet users. Unemployed and underemployed graduates are taking up jobs usually performed by less educated youth. Meager's work shows that the shrinking formal economy in northern Nigeria is driving more educated people into the informal economy. That in turn pushes out the less educated and leaves them more vulnerable to recruitment by Boko Haram or other groups, violent groups and networks. Ibrahim Abdallah and Abubakar Momo have pointed out to the use of the word youth men in some West African countries to describe the large number of unemployed 35-year-olds or older who are struggling to attain social adulthood. But waithood also represents a period of political marginalization, which deprives young people of the space for political engagement, liberty of expression, and other civil liberties. They complain about political repression, social injustice, humiliation, and loss of dignity and freedom. Many young people see waithood as stemming from national and global policies that have failed to reduce poverty and promote equitable and broadly distributed economic growth. Bad governance, corruption, and the absence of fundamental freedoms compound this predicament. Young people rebel against the widening gap between the rich and the poor and the rampant corruption that they observe as elites enrich themselves at other people's expenses. The concept of waithood can also be applied to the Western context, where in the past decades, young people have increasingly struggled with their transition to adult life. As sociologist or psychologist Jeffrey Arnett has noted, prolonged transitions to adulthood in the West, particularly amongst middle-class youth in the USA, mean that young people today stay in school longer, obtain their first paid jobs later, and start families much later than their 20th century counterparts. Arnett calls this period emerging adulthood, a new phase in the life course characterized by self-focused identity explorations, relative instability, and open possibilities. The expressions boomerang generation and yo-yo generation are used in the UK to depict young men and women who return home to continue to depend on their parents after graduating from college. In Italy, for example, bambuccione, or big dummy boys, is an expression that mocks the growing number of unmarried young men in their mid-20s and 30s who still live with their parents. In Japan, fritas or parasaito chinguru, parasite singles, refers to the growing number of young Japanese who are unable to participate in the labor market and begin their own families. The social reality of increased unemployment and its consequences means that more and more young people in the West can no longer live according to the societal standards for material and social well-being. Researchers argue that this problem is tied to the declining effectiveness of socio-economic and cultural processes in these affluent societies. But the situation is even more difficult for young people from poor, working class, and immigrant families in the developed world who lack access to quality education, to prospects of regular employment, and to secure livelihoods. Racial, ethnic, and class disadvantages compound one another. Statistics show that African American youths in the United States are less likely to graduate high school and go on to college than their white counterparts. Even with similar levels of education, they have greater difficulty finding employment. Young Black youth are trapped in a social environment of systemic failure. While African Americans make up only 13% of the population in the United States, there are markedly higher percentages of young Black males who are incarcerated, charged with homicide, drop out of school, face unemployment, and live in poverty. The consequence of incarcerations, for example, means that youth lose social and civic privileges and are blocked from job opportunities after release. Moreover, excessive policing of Black communities erodes their sense of belonging and reinforces their marginalization. Practices such as stop and frisk simply exacerbate the level of surveillance, suspicion, and repression that young Black men are already subjected to. Every stop, every search, every arrest, every racist snub, every sexist remark, and every homophobic joke sends routine, authoritative signals about what society considers legitimate and about whose status identity is to be affirmed or to be denied. Unlike Bob Dylan's generation, today's generation is acutely conscious of their marginal structural position. Young people no longer trust the state's willingness and ability to find solutions to their problems. In their shared marginalization, they are developing a sense of common identity and a critical consciousness that leads them to challenge the established order. Like other social groups, youth have always been involved in everyday processes of social change by fashioning the spaces within which they try to get by and assert their rights. Asef Bayat calls these dispersed actions non-movements, which he describes as quiet and unassuming daily struggles outside formal institutional channels, in which ordinary activities blend with political activism. Young women and men engage in civil society associations, in popular culture, in debates through cyber-social networks, and in political demonstrations. If we pay careful attention to the lyrics of their songs, the verses of their poems, the scripts of their plays, and to their discourses and images on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, WhatsApp, Twitter, and text messages, we uncover a very strong critique of the status quo. Over the past few years, however, young people from all over the world have moved from a moderate encroachment on the public space to an open and more vociferous takeover of the national political stage. They have been questioning their waithood status and demanding better lives, declaring enough is enough. In Tunisia and Egypt, young people took to the streets to articulate grievances ranging from unemployment and corruption to the denial of free expression and civil liberties. Using slogans such as Ben Ali dégage and dignity and freedom, not bread, the young protesters toppled the long-standing regimes of Ben Ali and Hosni Mubarak in 2011. In Dakar, rallying around the movement Y'en a marre, enough, Senegalese youths voted massively to remove Abdoulaye Wade in the 2012 elections. Similarly, in Burkina Faso in 2015, Le Ballet Citoyen, or Citizens' Broom, led thousands of young Burkinabe in street demonstrations against the government, driving Blaise Compaoré out after 27 years in power. In September 2015, South African university students protested against fee increases that would hinder access to higher education for poor Black students. The Fees Must Fall movement also called for the decolonization of the educational system and for transformation within universities in South Africa to address racial and gender inequalities. In Spain, the protest movement Los Indignados, the indignant ones, mobilized hundreds of thousands of young people in several cities in the country, and they took to the streets in series of demonstrations, assemblies, and occupations. They protested against the political and financial elites whom they blamed for the country's severe economic crisis. They questioned the political system as a whole and demanded democracia real ya, real democracy now. In the United States, the Occupy Wall Street movement rallied many young protesters against corporate greed and corporations' undue influence over government. Its focus on the nexus between state and corporate power and between public authority and private wealth created a common ground. Born in 2013 as a Twitter hashtag, Black Lives Matter emerged after George Zimmerman's acquittal in the fatal shooting of unarmed 17-year-old black youth, Trayvon Martin. The movement was crystallized in 2014 when the hashtag leaped from social movement into the streets during the Ferguson uprisings. Created by 3 strong female leaders, Black Lives Matter is galvanizing young people to fight against state-sanctioned violence. The movement sees social justice in the United States as intrinsically connected to systemic racism and inequality, which in turn results in public school segregation and massive unemployment of Black youth. The movement demands are broad-based, including an end to mass incarcerations, greater investments in education, and employment opportunities for Black youth. Through an unprecedented show of unity, by taking to the streets and braving police, dictatorships have been overthrown. Corrupt leaders voted out, unconstitutional presidential term extensions blocked, and governments forced to reverse unpopular decisions. In fact, from the vantage point outside dominant ideologies, young generations have shown that they are capable of envisioning society and polity anew, precisely because of what Karl Mannheim calls fresh contact, a novel outlook that arises as the young assimilate, develop, and alter the social and cultural repository received from previous generations. We have seen that young people have already effected significant changes. Their actions have expanded the political space for public participation and broadened the boundaries of individual freedoms, challenging the state's monopoly of the political discourse. In Tunisia, Senegal, and Burkina Faso, for example, populations often considered calm, docile, and intimidated have opposed the status quo with great courage and assertiveness. And in South Africa, the Fees Must Fall movement has forced the government to institute some reforms and to increase funding for higher education. At the same time, in the United States today, Black Lives Matter is influencing a national discourse about equity and citizenship by going beyond the critique of the justice system to a structural criticism of systemic racism. The achievements made by these youth movements so far can be credited to 3 main factors. First, the establishment of a new language. A priority of these movements was the production of appealing slogans and pieces of counter-hegemonic discourse. Words and expressions such as enough, dégage, 1% versus 99%, fees must fall, real democracy now, and Black Lives Matter embody simple and accessible messages that young people can relate to. The decentralized processes of production and consumption of language through online environments disrupts established conventions about authorships and enables this new language to be owned collectively. In this way, language has become a key attribute of the identity of these youth movements and not just a tool. Second, the digital environment multiplied the messages and accelerated their distribution. Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, WhatsApp, and text messages have been instrumental in energizing and mobilizing the masses. The use of the internet has facilitated cross-border exchanges in real time. Intensive use of social media has triggered and enabled significant changes beyond the political struggles and dilemmas of earlier movements. Despite the dangers of misinformation, the autonomous online spaces facilitated the reframing of political issues and of politics itself. And third, internet social networks facilitated horizontal communications and obviated the need for centralized organizations with strong hierarchical structures. The structures and modes of organizations of these youth movements reflect a generation's deep dissatisfaction with the political system. They have constituted themselves into organic voluntary associations of individual citizens, activists, bloggers, political communicators, grievances, local assemblies, and informal leadership networks. They strive to create new forms of political engagement based on broad, decentralized, horizontal, and consensus-based associations which are imbued with strong anti-hierarchical and anti-authoritarian principles. As Melina Abdullah from Black Lives Matter pointed out, and I quote, "There is a difference between being leaderless and leaderful," end of quote. Indeed, these movements draw on centered leadership approaches, on group-centered leadership approaches. Nevertheless, these movements have a long way to go towards broader systemic change. Once old regimes fall and the enthusiasm and energy of the streets wane, young activists find themselves more divided. The broad unity forged during protests dissipates as they struggle to articulate a new common purpose and to define a new political role for themselves. And traditional and more established political forces quickly move in to occupy the institutional vacuum, often reverting to politics as usual with a few minor cosmetic changes. This could be seen, for example, in the tensions that emerged between leaders of Sassoufi and Le Ballet Citoyen in Burkina Faso after the fall of Blaise Compaoré. In Senegal, the Y'en a marre movement suffered from accusations that it received funding from Western countries. Tunisian activists struggled to negotiate new roles during the post-Ben Ali transition. And today, young Tunisians constitute the majority of Islamic State recruits, with about 6,000 of them fighting in Syria and Libya. The demise of Los Indignados and the Occupy movement is also attributed to the difficulty in sustaining momentum beyond the street protests. These factors expose the weaknesses of the large horizontal front in negotiating access to power within existing political conditions. Young people have avoided the structures and the political ideology that turn a protest movement into a political party. They reject the established political order as corrupt and inadequate, but so far they have been unable to produce an alternative political model. Reflecting on Los Indignados, Bauman observed that, and I quote, "The movement is emotional. It lacks forward thinking. It can only prepare the ground for the construction in the future of a different type of organization," end quote. Actually, following the demise of the movement, in 2014, Pablo Iglesias, a young professor in his 30s, established Podemos, We Can, as a formal political party. Podemos skillfully embedded the vision, linguistic strategies, and contents of Los Indignados and made a careful use of social media, promising to honor the key demands of the youth movement. The poor showing of Podemos in the 2016 elections in Spain and its subsequent alliance with the Spanish left that created the Unidos Podemos coalition generated internal tensions and raised questions about the ability of a vertical party to represent a broader horizontal coalition such as Los Indignados. Youth movements continue to wrestle with identifying the appropriate structures and modes of organization for creating more sustainable political interventions that can shape public policies. There is a growing understanding amongst young activists that to effect systemic change, a broader and deeper approach is needed beyond national street protests. The question remains, can young people tackle the large global system that still relegates them to the periphery of modernity? In Africa, confronting bad governance and corrupt leaders at home has led young activists to understand the limitations of effecting meaningful and far-reaching socioeconomic and political change in their countries. The neoliberal paradigm has hindered the ability of weak nations to attain socio-economic sovereignty. As many analysts have pointed out, structural adjustment programs have seriously weakened the developing states' ability to determine national policies and priorities and to uphold the social contract with their citizenry. Indeed, neoliberalism diminished the role of the state, replacing public ownership with private enterprise and the withdrawal of the welfare programs. Developing aid is often offered with strict conditions, and those in power in developing countries build close links with the wealthy and powerful in the north. But this is not a novel problem. Already in the 19th century, Russian author and philosopher Fyodor Dostoevsky noted the weakness of the modern ideal of individual freedom for all by identifying the gap between the theory and the practice of liberal individualism. He considered this to be the very torment of modernity, in which individuals educated to believe in lofty notions of personal freedom and sovereignty ended up confronted by a reality that cruelly negated such dreams. Dostoevsky astutely noted that in France, as in other modern societies, the idea of liberté was a reality only for the wealth and the powerful. Today, neoliberalism continues to emphasize individualistic ideals and expects citizens to become entrepreneurs able to repackage themselves to face a dynamically evolving capitalist economy. But capital moves globally, continually, across national boundaries in search of profit maximization, leaving behind and depriving millions of people. Defeat and humiliation have become commonplace experiences for many young people around the world that are confronted with this global capitalist endeavor of profit-making and franchising the individual self. Even established liberal democracies such as the United States seethe with angry disillusionment across class and racial divides. Decades of liberal socioeconomic policies have led to a political system geared to facilitate private money-making. As the Occupy movement put it, wealth is concentrated amongst 1% of the population who dominate society, while 99% struggle. Bernie Sanders echoed this sentiment when he stated that the issue of income and wealth inequality constituted the great moral, economic, and political issue of our time. Racial and ethnic discrimination is also at the center of this debate. In his book, Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates eloquently underscores the experience and the struggles of being young and Black in America. The Black Lives Matter movement's fight against state-sanctioned violence, racial profiling, police brutality, mass incarcerations, and lack of opportunities for Black people embodies this struggle. But the situation is equally dire for the latecomers of modernity, those from the periphery for whom the gap between the notion of individual liberation and the daily experience of poverty and exclusion is even greater. The number of young people from Africa condemned to the waiting room of modernity have grown significantly in recent decades. Young people's feelings of powerlessness and deprivation are exacerbated today by the ability boosted by the internet and social media to constantly compare their own lives with the lives of the fortunate and privileged. For many, this contradiction has become intolerable. Young Africans are contesting their marginalization, and they are trying to negotiate new terms of membership into the global community. Movements such as Yanamar in Senegal, Le Ballet Citoyen and Sassoufi in Burkina Faso, Filimbi and La Lucha in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sassoufi comme ça in Gabon, and many others, are beginning to realize that united they will be stronger. They are working towards a Pan-African coalition of youth for change, which includes links with young people in the Africa diaspora in Europe and North America. these new youth movements are inspired by the anti-colonial resistance of an earlier generation, and they cite Patrice Lumumba, Gandhi, Thomas Sankara, Fanon, Malcolm X, and Nelson Mandela as some of their role models. In March 2015, when these movements met in Kinshasa, over 40 activists were detained by the Congolese police on the grounds of inciting insurrection. Fadel Barro from Myanmar, one of the detainees in Kinshasa, pointed out, and I quote, "They cannot imprison hope, and the youth will continue to mobilize," end quote. A recent meeting of this Pan-African Youth Coalition was organized in Ouagadougou in October this year with the goal of creating a united strategy. It is too early to know whether this generation will indeed be able to achieve far-reaching systemic change. What is clear is the emergence of a strong personal and collective realization that they can be a force for change. It means that this Waitwood generation that may seem to be doomed to lurch between a sense of inadequacy, despondency, and lack of fulfillment is courageously challenging the establishment. Radical and systemic change will take time. It will require more organization, more structure, and a new kind of politics. It might even take more than a generation, but I believe that young people in Waitwood have already started the process. And this, maybe, is where we can find hope for the future of the world. And I thank you very much.
I just want to present Dr. Hanwana with a plaque from the African Studies Association.
Oh, thank you.
And you have a hoodie? Nice little fleece. Well, it's a fleece jacket. It doesn't actually have a hood, so you know it's not really a hoodie. And then, of course, a tote bag. What would life be without a tote bag? And yeah, I think Dr. Hanwana is willing to take some questions. If anybody wants to ask some questions, I don't know if we have a microphone here or not. But in any event, for the next couple of minutes, she's I think willing to answer some questions if anybody has some.
Thank you.
And
Could I ask you to come down to the front here? There's a microphone down here.
Thank you.
My name is Joya Urezi, and I just wanted to say, Dr. Hanwana, I absolutely loved your talk. But my question is, right at the end of your talk, you mentioned the youth movements that are meeting at places like Ouagadougou. If you can tell us a little more about those movements, I think you cited them as sort of the hope for the change, and that somehow they're being able to bridge the gap that you mentioned between being a youth movement and bringing about systemic change. So if you could talk a little more about that. Thank you.
Thank you. I would take 2 or 3 and
Check, check. Here's one.
Hear me. Okay. Try this one. Better. My name is Judith Van Allen. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. Along with talking more about the youth movements, could you say more about the role of young women in the movements?
The back there?
I got it.
I'll come to you in a second.
Thank you. I was wondering how we can make sense of the fact that some of the leaders of the youth movements you cite, including Fadel, are themselves quite a bit older than many of the people they're leading and got their starts in protests really a generation before.
Identify yourself.
My name is Lisa Mueller from Macalester College. Thanks.
Boa tarde. Boa tarde aqui. Boa tarde, minha irmã. José Augusto Costa, moçambicano, e I really enjoyed your presentation, and I enjoy the fact that you talked about some of these issues in relation to modernity, which is really one of those passions of mine lately. And I wanted to know, the one thing that I'm interested in knowing is the status of the Mozambican youth, in terms of this, and particularly, not just the Mozambican, in fact, the Lusophone youth, because I don't see us being as radical and as, probably more of active in this space as, despite the rap music we hear from some of our, really wonderful artists. And so, anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps you'd like to respond?
Sure. Is this on? Thank you very much for the very interesting questions. In relation to the new youth movements, well, I feel that the hope is there because it's the kind of a new frontier. We have seen that between 2011 and now, young people have been manifested in the streets. Some dictators, some political leaders have been thrown out, but things seem to be going in the same direction. Young people continue to be unhappy because they cannot make that transition. And this alliance of different youth movements across the continent, even across language divides, and the realization that it's not just about internal and country politics, but it's more of a broader systemic situation, might start making young people ask questions and trying to find strategies to move their struggle to a next step. But I don't know how these things will unfold. In fact, recently I was talking in Ouagadougou. Before this meeting, I was in Ouagadougou in September or August, and youth leaders there were talking very much about this sense of needing to be united and doing a lot more. And there is great inspiration also that is drawn from the anti-colonial struggles and how they don't want to appear as an isolated thing that appears in this particular point in time, but it's linked to a whole history of contestation, of resistance in the African continent. And so they're trying to frame their struggle and their contestation within a broader situation. So it remains to be seen. I don't have a lot to say about it because it's something that is ongoing. I don't know what happened in the meeting that happened in Ouagadougou. It was last month. But it's something that I would definitely want to follow up because I think that would be the direction that I would kind of continue to take my research and observe how the process unfolds. And the role of young women. We see a lot of young women involved in this, both in street protests, both in the organizations, in the movements, in the background of the organizations, helping those who are in the front lines with food, with preparing slogans and writing blogs. There are a lot of young women in Africa who are using social media and have a lot of blogs and sites that support each other. But it is true that we still see in the forefront a lot of men, especially because the struggle is still very much at the level of the street, and those who appear in the street are mainly males. but young women are playing a very, very strong role. And I have talked to amazing young women throughout the continent who have been part of this process. So, and there is a lot. In fact, I'm kind of preparing with, which has to do with some other project that I have, which is just to focus on young women and just focus on what they're doing and how they see, also getting very specific points of views and ideas of how to even increase young women's visibility in these movements. Well, whether the leaders are much older, some of them are, others are not, but I think young people tend to gravitate to messages and a kind of language that resonates with them. For example, in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn seemed to kind of galvanize a lot of young British youth, exactly because of the message that he was delivering. I don't think young people are hung on the fact that this is a young person or this is an older person, but it's about the message, it's about the struggle, it's about the ideals, and it's about those aspirations. And we saw also here how young people in America gravitated towards Bernie Sanders during the elections last year. And in relation to the Lusophone youth and the Mozambican youth that my fellow countrymen asked me, you know, it's the same as all over the continent. There are a lot of young people in Mozambique organizing, but it's not often visible in the streets. They have a lot of associations, they have a lot of groups that are doing things. The manifestations that come in those periods when, you know, there are periods of hardship when people say enough is enough, like we had the 2008 riots about the increasing prices of gas and food. We had the 2010 riots that blocked Maputo for 3 days. And so, you know, you have those kind of sporadic moments. But I think what is interesting to look at, it's what happened in between those bursts of street protests. And I think there is a lot of mobilizing that is going on that we might not see in the media or in everyday life, but that we see in everyday life, but not in the public sphere all the time. I think one of the sites that we can find this, it's through the social media and the networks and their debates, their images, their discourses, what they're saying to one another, how they understand their situation, the situation in the countries, in their countries, in their communities, etc. So I think there is a lot going on there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Honwana. We've actually come to the end of the time slot for the keynote, but please join me in thanking our guest lecturer again.
Thank you.
And I'm sure as we slowly clear out, she'd be happy to talk perhaps informally with people who have other questions. And please let me take the opportunity to remind you that at 4 p.m. today, the ASR is also sponsoring How to Get Your Article Published panel. And we encourage everyone, particularly emerging scholars, to consider coming and hearing and learning more about the process of peer review and demystifying the process. Thank you.